For a man who has already lost everything. The silence is not an absence of sound, but a constant presence. It is the weight in the air, the dust motes dancing in the lonely shafts of light, the hollow echo in a house built for three but occupied by one. This was the world of Jonas Hale, a world carved out of a land that asked for everything and gave back just enough to break your heart. The land around his ranch was a study in stillness. It was a flat, quiet expanse, covered in a brittle crust of early frost that clung stubbornly to the earth long past midday. There was no green to soften the view, only the dry, cracked dirt and fences that leaned with the exhaustion of years. There wood gray and splintered. Above it all, the sky was a vast, colorless canvas, as if it too had forgotten the vibrancy of life. From a great distance, the lowing of cattle could be heard, their calls thin and fragile in the cold, sharp air. Jonas leaned against the weathered post of his porch, his arms folded across his chest. His coat was unbuttoned, a silent defiance to the cold that no longer seemed to touch him. He had been awake since before the first hint of dawn, his movements slow and deliberate as he fixed a busted latch on the chicken pen, checked the pump, and walked the fence line. The cold used to seep into his bones, a bitter reminder of all that was gone. Now, it was just part of the quiet, the routine, the heavy weight of another long winter stretching out before him. His ranch was a lonely outpost on the edge of a town that was little more than a ghost of its former self. Cinderbrush was a place clinging to existence by a thread, a single trading post, a church with a leaning steeple, and a handful of houses that seemed to be slowly surrendering to the elements. He had bought this land after the war, bringing a wife out to this unforgiving place. With his own 2 hands, he had built the barn and the house, raising walls against the wind and a roof against the sky, creating a sanctuary for a future that was never meant to be. 6 winters ago, the fever had swept through like a thief in the night, taking both his wife and his infant son in the same cruel week. After that, the words inside him simply dried up. He stopped talking, kept the ranch running on pure muscle memory, ate what he needed to survive, and spoke to no one. It was easier that way. Silence could not betray you. Silence could not be taken from you. He was about to turn and go inside when a flicker of movement on the horizon caught his eye. Beyond the fence line, a figure was walking up the road. It was a woman, her steps slow and unsteady, and she was carrying something bundled against her chest. She had no horse, no wagon, just her own 2 feet grinding through the cold dirt. She seemed to be holding herself together by sheer will, a fragile silhouette against the immense, empty landscape. Jonas didn't move, but his gaze remained fixed on her, a deep, ingrained caution stirring within him. He hadn't had a visitor in years, especially not one like this. She reached the wooden gate and stopped, her posture a contradiction. She stood straight, her chin up, even as her knees looked ready to buckle. She wore no coat against the biting wind, just a thin, dust-covered calico dress, tied at the waist with a simple piece of string. Her hair was pinned back in a messy knot, and her face was a pale mask of exhaustion. Her lips split, her brown eyes sunken but alarmingly alert. She shifted the bundle in her arms, revealing a child, too quiet, too still. Her hand rose, and she knocked once on the gatepost with the back of her knuckles. It was not a plea, but an announcement. Then, she waited. For a long moment, Jonas remained on the porch, a statue of indecision. He weighed the possibilities. A vagrant, perhaps. Someone on the run. But her stance didn't beg for help. It was the posture of someone who had nothing left to lose and was therefore, in a strange way, fearless. He stepped off the porch, his boots crunching on the frozen ground, each step closing the distance on a disruption he did not want but could not ignore. As he drew near, he could see the story etched on her face, The sleepless nights, the hunger, the gnawing fear. He stopped a few feet from the gate. "I ain't here for charity," she said, her voice raw and cracked, as if it hadn't been used in days. Her eyes did not flinch. There was fear in them, yes, but it was buried deep beneath a layer of hardened determination. "I'll work," she continued, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Milk cows, clean stalls, patch clothes, cook. Whatever. You don't got to be kind. Just give him something to eat." She shifted the child higher on her chest. He was a boy, no older than 2, his face pale and thin, his head lolling against her collarbone. It was the kind of sickness that came from too many cold nights and too many empty bellies. "What's your name?" Jonas asked, his own voice emerging rough from disuse. "Eda Brooks," she said. "His name's Cal." Jonas was silent, his eyes scanning the empty road behind her. There were no horse tracks, no sign of a wagon. Just the solitary line of her own footprints. "Where you coming from?" "Missouri," she said, her gaze unwavering. "Walked most of it. Rode some. Don't matter now." The silence between them was heavy with unspoken questions. Jonas weighed his options. He didn't know her. This could be a trick, a ploy. But then his eyes fell on the child, on the skin stretched tight over his small cheeks, on the faint crust around his mouth. He remembered, with a sharp, unwelcome pang, how small his own son had felt in his arms the night the fever took him. It was a memory he kept locked away, but this woman and this child were a key turning in that rusty lock. "You can sleep in the barn," he said finally, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "It's dry." Eda nodded once. Not with gratitude, but with the simple acceptance of a deal being struck. He opened the gate, and she passed through, a ghost of a woman carrying the last ember of her world. He turned and walked toward the barn, and she followed without a word, one hand still wrapped tightly around the small boy's back, a silent promise of protection against a world that had offered none. The barn door creaked open on protesting hinges, revealing a space that smelled of hay, earth, and time. It was musty, but calm. Stacks of hay lined one wall, feed sacks were piled in a corner, and a rough cot, which Jonas used during calving season, sat against the far wall. A lantern hung from a nail by the door. Jonas lit it, and the warm, flickering light washed over Eda's face, illuminating the sharp cheekbones, the faint, purple bruise along her jaw, and the deep-set exhaustion in her eyes. She moved with a quiet efficiency, kneeling in the clean hay and laying the boy gently onto the cot. She adjusted his thin blanket, her movements practiced and tender, before sitting beside him, her back against the wall. And then, as if a string holding her upright had finally been cut, her body slumped, the last of her formidable strength seeping away into the hay-strewn floor. Jonas left without a word and returned with 2 thick wool blankets and a chipped bowl of boiled potatoes, still warm. He handed them to her. She didn't say thank you, but her eyes conveyed a message deeper than words. She simply took the food, broke off a small piece, and gently coaxed the child to chew. Jonas stood near the doorway, watching for a moment. Her hands, though chapped and raw, were incredibly gentle. Every movement was for the boy. He had seen that kind of singular focus before, in soldiers who had lost everything but their one last comrade. He didn't ask what she had run from. The bruise on her jaw was a quiet, brutal testament. "You need anything else?" he asked. She looked up, her eyes heavy with a weariness that went bone deep. "No." He nodded and stepped outside, pulling the heavy barn door closed behind him. The wind had picked up, and he stood for a moment longer than he needed to, staring out at the darkening horizon. She was young, He realized, maybe not yet 30. Too young to look so worn, so stripped of all softness. He knew that look. He had seen it on the faces of men returning from battle. The ones whose bodies had made it back, but whose souls had been left behind on some forgotten field. Back inside his own house, the silence felt different. It was no longer just his own. He sat at the kitchen table with a tin cup of coffee that had long gone cold. He didn't light a lamp, content to sit in the growing dark, listening to the wind howl. He was a man who did not trust easily. The world had taught him that lesson with brutal efficiency. But there was something about the woman in his barn, the way she hadn't begged, hadn't flinched, hadn't offered a single lie, that sat differently with him. That night, for the first time in 6 years, he did not allow his thoughts to drift to the attic where a small, dust-covered cradle sat in the darkness. Instead, before he went to bed, he set a second tin cup on the table. Just in case. By morning, the frost had thickened, encasing the world in a brittle, white shell. The air didn't just chill the skin, it seemed to stiffen the very bones. Jonas stepped outside before dawn, his breath pluming in the frigid air. The faint light of the barn lantern was still visible through the slats. He walked toward it slowly, not with suspicion, but with a quiet caution. He opened the barn door to find Eda already awake, sitting upright against the stall wall, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. The boy, Cal, was curled at her side, his breathing shallow but steady. She looked up as the door creaked, her eyes alert but not startled. "You eat?" Jonas asked. She nodded, gave him what was left. He left and returned with a canteen of water and a bowl of warm oats from his own breakfast. She accepted them without ceremony, spooning a little into Cal's mouth before eating the rest herself in quick, efficient bites, like someone long accustomed to rationing every morsel. Jonas leaned against the stall post, his arms folded. "What happened to your leg?" he asked, his voice low. She glanced down, instinctively pulling the hem of her skirt over her worn boot. Wagon axle snapped. 3 towns east. Jumped to grab him before it rolled. She nodded toward Cal. "Didn't land right." She paused. "Got a lift for a ways, but the man started talking like he wanted more than my thanks. I took off before it got bad." Jonas gave a single, understanding nod. He didn't press for more. She had told him enough. "Any family out here?" "No," she said, a long pause hanging in the air. "Not anymore." That answered another question he hadn't asked, why she had stopped here. It wasn't that she had chosen his ranch. It was that his ranch was the last stop, the final fence post before the land dissolved into nothing but unforgiving wilderness. It was the edge of the world. "You can stay, long as you work," he stated, making it a clear transaction. "I aim to," she replied, her voice firm. And so, an unspoken agreement was forged in the cold morning air of the barn. By mid-morning, Eda was at work. She moved with a noticeable stiffness, but she never complained. While Jonas mended a stretch of fence, she gathered what little laundry they had, built a small fire behind the house, and began to scrub the clothes with raw, red hands. Cal, still too weak to walk much, was laid on a blanket nearby, a silent observer wrapped against the cold. Jonas watched her from a distance as he split logs. She wasted no motion. She never stopped. There was a strength in her, not of muscle, but of pure survival. He recognized it because he had been forced to build the very same kind of strength within himself after the world had gone quiet, after the cradle upstairs began to gather dust, after there was no one left to listen even if he had found the words to speak. That night, he cooked beans and cornbread and set 2 plates on the table. She came inside, saw the second plate, and didn't hesitate. She simply sat down, fed Cal first, and then began to eat. The silence between them was no longer empty or grieving. It was a working silence, earned and mutual. Later, as Cal slept on a rug near the warmth of the stove, she sat watching the embers glow. "You had family once?" she asked, her voice soft. He hesitated for only a second before nodding. "Wife? Son?" she asked, already knowing the answer. "Gone." He nodded again. "Long time ago. 6 years." She didn't offer pity, for which he was grateful. Pity was a useless currency. "Cal had a brother and a sister," she said after a long moment, her eyes fixed on the fire. "Lost them both. Same week." The air between them grew thick, but it was a shared weight. "Fever?" Jonas asked. She nodded slowly. "You stop thinking after that. You just start moving." He understood that more than she could ever know. He stood, retrieved a folded blanket from a cabinet, and handed it to her. She took it, holding it close as if it were the only answer needed. He watched as she carried Cal to the spare cot he had brought in, tucking him in gently before lying down beside him, the blanket pulled over them both. Jonas stood in the doorway for a long time, one hand resting on the frame. Something had shifted the moment she had stepped onto his land. Not in the ranch, but in him. It was a small, quiet, almost imperceptible change, but it was there. He went to the attic that night. He didn't open the trunk with his wife's things or touch the cradle. But he did wipe the dust from its wooden railing with the palm of his hand. Then he went back downstairs and sat in his chair, watching over the woman and her son as they slept under his roof. The sound of their breathing was softer than the wind outside, and for the first time in a very long time, the silence in the house didn't feel like grief. It felt like something beginning. The days settled into a rhythm, not one of ease or lightness, but one of steadfast purpose. The mornings came early and gray. Jonas would rise first, as he always had, but now his own solitary movements were accompanied by the quiet sounds of life from the main room, Eda wrapping Cal in a blanket, the soft scrape of the poker in the stove, the gentle clink of a cup. Her presence filled the corners of the house that had been vacant for so long, not with noise, but with a quiet, determined energy. The boy, Cal, was growing stronger. He had started to stand on his own, clutching the sides of chairs and taking wobbly, triumphant steps across the braided rug. A small, private smile would sometimes touch Eda's lips as she watched him, a fleeting expression of relief that would vanish as quickly as it appeared. But it was real. It was on the 7th morning after her arrival that the outside world intruded. The postman, who passed by on his route only once a week, left a small bundle of mail in the box by the road. Jonas rarely received anything more than a feed invoice, but this time, tucked between the usual papers, was an envelope with no return address. The handwriting was heavy and slanted, almost aggressive. He opened it with his callous thumb. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The message was brief and chilling. "Seen a woman and a kid heading west. Calico dress, brown hair. Might be yours. Keep looking. She's worth money." There was no name, no signature. Just those stark, possessive words. Jonas folded the note and slipped it deep into his coat pocket. He didn't show it to Eda. Not yet. He wasn't sure what it fully meant, but a cold knot formed in his gut. He didn't like the tone. He didn't like the word money attached to a mother and her child. That afternoon, as Eda washed clothes out back, Jonas sat on the porch, sharpening a blade that was already sharp. It was something to do with his hands while his mind raced, his eyes scanning the empty road. For the first time since she had arrived, that old, Familiar instinct from the war began to stir, the one that whispered of trouble on the horizon. He thought about all the questions he hadn't asked. About the man she had run from. About whether that man had the means, or the motive, to follow her all this way. Later, inside the house, Cal toddled over and tugged on the leg of Jonas's jeans, holding up his small cloth rabbit. One of its ears was now missing, crudely stitched back on by Eda's quick hand. Jonas took the toy and looked at it. "You hold on to this little guy pretty tight," he said quietly. Cal just nodded, his thumb in his mouth. Jonas handed it back. "Good. You hold on." By dusk, as Eda stirred a pot of beans over the stove, Jonas finally broke the silence that had been weighing on him all day. "You ever figure someone might come looking for you?" She froze. The stirring stopped. She didn't turn around. "I figure someone will," she said after a long pause. "But I was counting on being hard to find." Jonas stood from his chair and walked to the doorway. "Got a letter today," he said, his voice low. "Said a woman and a child were seen. Said you were worth money." Eda set the spoon down carefully on the stovetop and turned to face him. Her face was pale, but her eyes were clear. "That would be his brother," she said, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. "They ran cattle together. But they ran other things, too. I saw something I shouldn't have. He was going to trade me to a man he owed, to square a debt. That's when I left." Jonas looked at her for a long moment. He didn't need to ask what she had seen. The truth was in her eyes. All that mattered was that someone out there believed they owned her. "I can keep moving," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Leave tomorrow. Just let me take some bread." "No," Jonas said, the word sharp and definite. She blinked, as if she couldn't have heard him right. "You stay," he said again, his voice softer but no less firm. "This place is far. It's quiet. If anyone comes, I'll handle it." She just stared at him, a storm of confusion and disbelief in her eyes. "Why? Why would you do that?" He didn't answer right away. He looked past her, at the small home they were inadvertently creating, at the child sleeping peacefully by the fire. "Because you showed up and you didn't ask for pity," he said finally. "Because that boy laughs now. And because I ain't had a reason to check the damn mail in 6 years." Her expression softened, just a fraction, but her hands were still clenched into tight fists at her sides. "I don't want you hurt," she said. "Not over me." Jonas looked her straight in the eye, his gaze unwavering. "This isn't about you. And it isn't about me. It's about what's right. You're just someone who ain't had a fair shot yet." The silence that followed was not heavy. It was solid, built on something real that neither of them was ready to name. Later that night, as the wind howled outside, Jonas quietly moved his rifle from the back room and leaned it against the wall by the front door. It wasn't an act of paranoia, but of precaution. He checked the locks on the doors and windows, not because he thought them weak, but because something had fundamentally changed. This was no longer just his house. It was a sanctuary. He wasn't scared. Not anymore. For the first time in years, the silence of his life had been broken, and he had found something worth protecting. And this time, he wasn't going to lose it. The days that followed were draped in a blanket of tension. Snow began to fall, not a blizzard, but a persistent, quiet dusting that turned the world brittle and white. The wind scraped against the windows like a restless spirit, and the cold found its way under every door and through every crack. Inside the small house, a fortress was being quietly built. Jonas chopped wood with a renewed vigor, each swing of the axe a defiant blow against the encroaching threat. Eda, now moving with more confidence, handled the chores inside. She had stopped asking what needed to be done. She simply saw and did. The house, which had been a monument to grief, was now a functioning home. It smelled of baking bread and wood smoke. The floors were swept. And sometimes, the quiet was punctuated by Cal's soft giggle, a sound that was slowly stitching Jonas's fractured world back together. One afternoon, Eda stood in the barn doorway, her arms crossed, watching Jonas reset a broken latch. "There's something I need to ask," she said, her voice steady against the wind. He didn't stop his work, just nodded for her to continue. "When this is over, if it's ever over, what happens to us?" Jonas straightened up and turned to face her. The wind whipped a loose strand of hair across her face. Her cheeks were pale from the cold, but her gaze was direct. "I figure you stay," he said simply. "If that's what you want." Her throat moved as she swallowed hard. "Even with the trouble I brought here." Jonas looked past her, toward the house. In the front window, the curtain stirred, and Cal's small hand pressed against the glass. "You brought life back to this place," Jonas said, his voice rough with an emotion he rarely allowed himself. "That's more than most people ever bring." Eda looked away, toward the vast, snow-covered plains. "I've never been asked to stay before," she said softly. "Only told to leave." She was waiting, he knew, to see if the world would finally allow her to believe in a kindness without consequence. Later that evening, as they prepared supper in the warm kitchen, a sharp knock sounded at the front door. They both froze. Jonas's hand stilled, the knife he was using to chop vegetables held motionless. Eda's shoulders went rigid. No one ever knocked on that door. Jonas moved first, his actions slow and deliberate. He wiped his hands on a cloth and walked to the door, grabbing the rifle from where it leaned against the wall. He kept it low, out of sight but ready. Eda stood close behind him, her eyes wide and fixed on the door. He opened it to find Sheriff Walt Loring standing on the porch, his beard flecked with snow. The sheriff was a middle-aged man with tired eyes that had seen too much. His gaze went straight past Jonas to Eda. Jonas instinctively stepped forward, blocking the view. "Sheriff," he said, his tone flat. Walt tipped his hat. "Jonas. Didn't mean to spook you. A stranger passed through town. Said he was looking for a woman and a child. Match day. Rough description." Eda's breath caught behind him. Jonas could feel her fear. "Where is he now?" Jonas asked. "Stayed in town last night," Walt said, his voice low. "Told the bartender he'd be riding out this way at first light. He has money, Jonas, and a piece of paper he claims is a legal contract. Says she's his property." The sheriff sighed, a weary sound. "I know she ain't. But the law out here, it can bend in the wrong hands." Jonas looked back once at Eda. Her face was a mask of hollow dread. "I'm not giving her up," Jonas said, his voice a low growl. The sheriff looked at him for a long, measuring moment. "Then you best be ready. He ain't coming to ask nicely." He turned to leave, then paused. "Don't let it turn to blood, Jonas." Jonas shut the door and locked it. He turned to Eda. "He's coming," she whispered. Jonas nodded. "Soon." "I'm not scared for me," she said, her voice trembling but fierce. "But if he gets his hands on Cal." "He won't." She looked up at him, her eyes searching his. Why are you doing this for us?" Jonas didn't hesitate. "Because you matter," he said, the words simple and true. "Because he doesn't get to win." That night, They moved Cal to the bedroom in the back of the house. Jonas sat in his chair by the door, the rifle across his lap, a single lantern burning low. Eda didn't sleep. She sat in the rocking chair by the window, watching the snow fall against the dark glass. They didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. The lines had been drawn. They were ready. Whatever came with the dawn, they would not run. Not this time. The snow continued to fall through the night, a silent, steady curtain that muffled the world and isolated the small ranch completely. Inside, the lantern cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. Jonas sat in his chair, a sentinel at the door, his mind alert, measuring every creak of the old house against the soft whisper of the wind. This wasn't a battlefield, but it was a front line. This was his home. The bedroom door opened softly, and Eda emerged, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She looked exhausted, but her eyes were sharp, her posture resolute. "He's sleeping," she said, her voice a low murmur. "Like there's nothing wrong in the world." She came and sat in the chair across from him. "I thought I'd forgotten how this felt. The waiting." "You didn't forget," Jonas said gently. "You just survived." The morning came slowly, a reluctant gray light pushing through the clouds. After checking the restless cattle in the barn, Jonas walked the perimeter of his property. The snow was a pristine, unbroken canvas. Nothing. Not yet. By noon, the first sign appeared. A single rider on the ridge, then a second, dark figures against the white snow. "They're coming," Jonas said as he stepped back into the house. Eda took Cal into the bedroom, settled him with his rabbit, and closed the door. She came back out, her face pale but determined. "Do I hide?" "No," Jonas said, his voice firm. "You stand with me." Minutes later, the sound of hooves crunching in the snow reached the porch. Jonas opened the door just as two men reined in their horses at his gate. The first was lean and clean-shaven, wearing a fine wool coat that spoke of money and arrogance. The second was the hired muscle, broad and menacing. The man in the coat dismounted, his movements calm and proprietary. "Mr. Hale, I presume," he said, his smile thin and unpleasant. Jonas didn't move from the porch. "You have a name." "Samuel Kincaid. I'm here for my property." His eyes slid past Jonas, fixing on the doorway where Eda now stood. "I see no property of yours here," Jonas said, his voice level. "A woman. A child," Kincaid said, his gaze cold. "She took something that belonged to me." "She didn't take anything," Jonas countered. "She took herself." Eda stepped fully into view, her chin high. "I am not yours, Samuel," she said, her voice ringing with a clarity that defied her fear. "You broke a contract, Eda," he sneered. "You tried to trade me for a mule," she shot back. "You tried to sell my son." Jonas moved then, stepping down off the porch, placing himself directly between Kincaid and his home. "You can turn around and ride away now," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "There's no trouble here you want." Kincaid's hand brushed against his coat. The second man's hand drifted toward his holster. "Don't," Jonas said, the single word carrying the weight of a lifetime of violence he had tried to leave behind. The hired man hesitated. "I fought in the war," Jonas continued, his eyes locked on the man. "You draw that weapon, you won't be walking away." Kincaid, seeing the unyielding resolve in Jonas's eyes, held up a hand to stop his man. He looked back at Eda. "This isn't finished. The law will get here. You set one more foot on this land," Jonas said, and I'll show you how fast my law works. Kincaid stared, his arrogance finally cracking. He mounted his horse, his face a mask of fury. This isn't the end, he spat, before turning and riding away. Jonas watched them disappear over the ridge. He turned back to Eda, who stood gripping the porch rail, her knuckles white. "Are you all right?" he asked. She nodded, her eyes glassy. "He just left." "He didn't get what he came for," Jonas said. "He'll try the law next. But for today, we stood our ground." For the first time, she wasn't just running from a past threat, she was standing beside someone, defending a future. True to his word, Kincaid filed an official claim. Sheriff Loring brought the news 3 days later. They had a week, maybe less, before a traveling judge would hear the case. "So he can pull me back with ink and lies?" Eda asked, her voice flat. "Not if we speak first," Jonas answered. "We'll ride to town. We'll tell the truth." The ride to Cinderbrush was cold, but the sky was a brilliant, clear blue. Jonas, Eda, and Cal rode together, a small, determined unit. The courthouse was just a room in the back of the bank. Kincaid was already there, flanked by his men, looking confident. The judge, a man named Ambrose, was old but sharp-eyed. He listened to Kincaid's claim of broken contracts and stolen property. He examined the forged document. Then he looked at Eda. She stepped forward, holding Cal close. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady and clear. She told of the abuse, the fear, and the escape. "I didn't steal property, Your Honor," she finished. "I saved my son." Jonas stepped forward then. "Sir, I've buried my own family. I know what grief and desperation look like. This is not a thief. This is a mother who refused to quit." There was a long silence. The judge looked from Kincaid's smug face to Eda's honest one. He looked at the sleeping child. He then took Kincaid's contract and, without a word, tore it in half. "This court does not recognize the ownership of human beings," the judge said, his voice like cracking ice. "Your claim is denied. And if I hear you have harassed this woman or her child again, Mr. Kincaid, I will see you charged with fraud myself. You are free to leave." Kincaid stormed out, his defeat absolute. Outside, the sun felt warm on their faces. As they rode out of town, Cal woke up and smiled, blinking in the bright light. "You think he'll be back?" Eda asked. Jonas shook his head. "Not after that. He lost. He knows it." "I've never won anything before," she whispered. "You didn't win," Jonas corrected her gently. "You survived. And now, you get to live." The ride back to the ranch was different. The land was the same, but it felt lighter, filled with promise. That evening, as Jonas set 2 plates on the kitchen table, Eda came and stood beside him. "So," she said softly, "what now?" Jonas looked up, and for the first time in 6 years, a genuine smile touched his lips. "Now," he said, "we make it through the winter. Together." She sat down across from him, her own smile shy but real. "I never thought I'd find a place where I didn't have to keep one foot out the door." "You don't have to anymore," Jonas said, his voice full of a certainty that had been absent for too long. "You're home." And in the quiet of the small house, under the vast western sky, the silence was finally, truly broken. It was replaced by the steady, hopeful rhythm of a family, not of blood, but of choice. No more running. No more hiding. Just a woman, her son, and a man who had lost everything, finding that, together, they had everything worth staying for. And this time, it was a life that no one could ever take from them.